Well, one of the most distinctive and influential voices to emerge from the ruins of Ground Zero is that of Mark Steyn. British by birth and education, he plied his trade as a theatre critic at the Daily Telegraph before moving to North America. There, his Happy Warrior columns in the National Review magazine made him essential reading for those who craved an understanding of the post-9/11 world. His views, especially on radical Islam and demographics, made him a panto villain for some on the left. But his prose, his polemical gifts, and in particular his sense of the ridiculous made him essential reading on the right. His books became bestsellers, but they also made him a target for cancel culture. He spent years successfully fighting legal action brought by Canadian activists who accused him of hate speech. Mark Steyn joins me now from Vermont. Mark Steyn, thanks so much for joining us. Really do appreciate your time. Good to have you. Do I paint a fair description of your career there? I'm particularly struck by the fact you, it seems to me, join a long list of people who started out criticising things in the arts. You know, people like Rod Liddell was a music critic, or still is a music critic.
Right.
James Dellingpole, cinema critic. You were a theatre critic. Is there something in the nature of being an arts critic which has predisposed you to looking at the world in a certain way?
Well, I think plays and novels and movies and songs are where a nation tells its stories, and the stories it tells are very important, and they're more important than politics, at least in terms of who happens to be Lord Privy Seal this week. No disrespect to whoever is Lord Privy Seal this week. Don't bother writing in to correct me on that. But the point is the stories a nation tells itself tells you who that culture is. So I do think there is a reason why influential commentators, whether you're talking about Rod Liddell or Christopher Hitchens, are familiar with the stories we tell ourselves. That's absolutely the heart of what a society is. And
when you were writing, I was one of those people who bought the National Review just to read your column. It felt like essential reading at the time. I just wonder to what extent you felt in dealing with that incredibly serious stuff in the wake of 9/11 that you had to deploy humour to get away, in a sense, with some very, very tendentious, in the minds of some people, statements. Was it a deliberate policy on your part to try and coat some very uncomfortable truths with a smile and a giggle and some gallows humour, or was that just the way you wrote?
No, I think you should make jokes. If something matters, you should make jokes about it. That's one of the awful things about wokeness and cancel culture is one way to include people in society is actually to make jokes about them. So I don't like the way people quarantine comedy, and a comedian is somebody who stands on stage and makes jokes about, barcode scanners in supermarkets or whatever. You should be able to make jokes about war and pestilence and famine and all the rest of it. Western civilization is basically sliding off a cliff, and whoever succeeds us, whether it's the Chinese or it's the Mullahs or it's space aliens from planet Zongo, they're going to split their sides laughing at what we did to ourselves. So we won't have the last laugh, so we might as well at least get in the first laugh.
I think, Mark, you're quite unusual from your particular side of the debate in the context of what I just said there in my monologue, that it seems that people on the more conservative side of the aisle are not very good at reading the road ahead. I don't know if there's something in the nature of that mindset which makes them reluctant to project forward and actually make some serious guesses about what's coming down the track. I made the point in my monologue there that it was actually at a lunch with a friend of mine who said, look, you just can't see what's 5 years away, and maybe we need to try harder.
No, I think that's something to do with the conservative temperament, that well, you used a phrase, you said common law and common sense, and I'm very much into common law. Canada is a common law country, and the United States at least pretends to be one. But common sense presumes that people have something in common. And increasingly in our societies, there's a huge gulf between people who can very often be living in the same street. You know, the nice shishi gay couple living next door to the big bearded mullah and his, however many wives it is, might make chit-chat over the garden fence, but in a sense, what they have in common is actually very limited. So common sense presumes you have a sufficiently socially coherent society to have things in common. And it's perfectly obvious, you know, when you look at the way, if you have people, a society that does not have things in common, one consequence of that is that you need a big government to mediate relations between all these jostling, competing identity groups, so that you wind up to take a subject that you've been talking about on this station, you wind up with an appalling murder of a member of parliament that on the Friday afternoon, that by the Monday morning, everyone has agreed it should be talked about in terms of everything except the central reality of that story. So eventually, when you don't have a society that doesn't have enough in common to have common sense, everything in that society becomes fraudulent and covered up.
Mark, do you think that would be, if heaven forfend, if that had happened to a congressman or a senator in the States, would there have been a similar attempt, as you put it, at avoidance, at avoiding the elephant in the room, or would it have been different in the States?
Well, I like to think it would have been different, but it's true that we've seen, I mean, in some respects, for example, France is one of the, in part because they have they're a country with many problems, but they have in some ways, a more honest political debate. But in the United States, certainly, people always retreat to their tropes. So that, for example, when there's a mass shooting in America, if anything goes wrong, something that's slightly violent, if it's a white guy, and they know that in the first few minutes, the media are basically saying this is because of hateful, extremist, white male rhetoric. If they're not telling you who actually pulled off the thing, that means it's not a white guy, and they're all going very sotto voce about it, and it's just an event with no wider implications. For example, the Afghan guy whose dad was standing behind Hillary Clinton at some rally, who gunned everyone down in a gay nightclub. And that managed to get presented in the US media as another example of right-wing homophobia, as opposed to the actual reasons why that guy was driven to go along to the gay nightclub.
You mentioned France, Mark. When I think back to the couple of books of yours that I have read and your projections on demographics, I mean, it could almost be, when you listen to Eric Zemmour talking, maybe you read your books, I don't know, but I mean, we're 20 years on now from when you wrote that stuff, but he seems to be singing from your hymn book.
Well, he's trying to move the conversation. You know, he's quite upfront about it. I saw The Spectator, I think it was today, they're complaining that he's very anti-Anglophone. He's anti-British and he's anti-American. Well, so what? That goes for all French politicians. I think it was a former foreign minister of Monsieur Chirac who said 20 years ago that the Anglo-Saxons dedicated to the what he called the cretinization of our civilization. And, you know, if you look at X-Men 37, Cardboard Man 42, Franchise Girl 53, or whatever the next blockbuster is, it's hard actually to disagree with that. So that doesn't matter. What matters is that he's not just being rude about the British, he's also being rude about a lot of other trends in French life, because he thinks a resurgence of Gaullism is necessary to save the Republic. And in that sense, he's talking more honestly than even many members of Parliament would at Westminster. If you look at the map of France after the last election, I think it was the European elections 2 years ago, whatever it was, essentially Macron voters are concentrated in a dozen big French cities, and geographically the bulk of France in that election voted for Le Pen. They're telling the European political establishment, we're dissatisfied with the choices you present to us and we want something more. That's what Republican voters said about Donald Trump in 2015. And the more they keep saying we'd like a wider and wider choice, the more the European political establishment, the American political establishment says, no, 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 no. We're going to shrink the choices. We're going to leave politics within ever more narrow constraints. And if you want something beyond that, tough, you're not getting it.
Mark, you mentioned the common law. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking to Peter Boghossian, the professor who said, look, I've had enough of cancel culture on this campus, I'm quitting. But part of his story was that he faced a lot of hostility that actually, apart from anything else, just sucked him dry emotionally, legalistically, even financially. And I mentioned in my introduction before you came and joined us this evening that you face something similar in terms of lawfare. For viewers not familiar with the story, pray see it, if you could, in summary form, and how much of a toll it exacted on you, and whether it almost knocked you out of the game.
Well, I wrote a book that was a #1 bestseller in Canada. I mention that particularly because various persons went to the Canadian Islamic Congress, took the case to various Canadian human rights commissions. You now have similar bodies in almost every Western nation. And these are things that where you do not enjoy the protections of common law. You do not enjoy equality before the law. The plaintiff gets all his costs picked up by the taxpayer. Truth is not a defense. The balance, the genius of balance in English common law is not present in these pseudo-legalistic human rights tribunals. Although I was in a courthouse in British Columbia with the exact same royal coat of arms that you would find in a proper courthouse, they were just applying, though, this perversion of law. And what we're seeing here, really, I think, is the criminalization of dissent. So you don't just have a public policy difference, you've actually committed a crime. Now, you mentioned the police a few minutes ago. If you look at the police going round to somebody's house because they've made a joke about Nelson Mandela's funeral, the sort of things the British police, I mean, the United Kingdom, my cheap joke on Britain is that it's a land where everything is policed except crime. And these lazy coppers have decided that they would rather spend their time going round and chastising some fellow for making a transphobic tweet. I think some porn star who'd advertised for a partner for his porn film and was a little shocked to get a transgender lady who had a little bit more than he was in the mood for. The police looked into that case. So we now have a thing where essentially political differences are being de facto criminalized, or at least investigated as potential crimes. That's completely ridiculous. It doesn't speak well for us, and it arises from this perversion of a healthy common law society where everyone's equal before the law, to this new version of events where what matters is what particular identity groups you belong to. There was a case, I put it in a book of mine a few years ago, where a big shot imam said something that was regarded as anti-gay on the BBC, and a gay humanist newspaper picked up on the story and reported the imam's remarks. For the self-same set of words, the imam got investigated for homophobia by Scotland Yard, and the gay humanist newspaper got investigated for Islamophobia by Scotland Yard. So you have this ridiculous situation where the same words are guilty of a completely different crime according to who quotes them. We are destroying our inheritance, the legal inheritance of Britain and the Commonwealth countries is one of its great glories, and in the metropolitan power, at the heart of the imperial metropolis, these values are being trashed by things like this new online speech proposal from the Tories, for example.
And Mark, you'll get the chance to talk about this later this week. We know you're going to be standing in for Nigel Farage. We look forward to it very much indeed. Thanks so much for your time tonight. Thanks a lot.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.